The golden hues of late afternoon sunlight filtered gently through the towering oaks that lined the tranquil suburban street. Eleanor Davis, wearing her signature sun hat, strolled confidently along the familiar path. Her silver locket glimmered in the light, a cherished memento of her late husband Samuel. By her side was Duke, her loyal Rottweiler, his sleek, muscular frame moving with an air of quiet strength. The soft jingling of his collar was the only sound, besides the distant rustle of leaves. For Eleanor, this walk was a sacred daily ritual. The neighborhood, which had been her home for over 4 decades, held a mix of memories, some warm, others heavy with unspoken tension. But Eleanor walked with dignity, her head held high, ignoring the occasional lingering gazes that seemed to question her presence. "You ready, boy?" she asked softly, her voice carrying warmth. Duke wagged his tail in response, his sharp ears flicking at the sound of her voice. The two continued past manicured lawns and pristine picket fences, offering polite nods to the occasional passerby. But as they turned onto Maple Avenue, Duke's posture shifted. His ears perked and his body tensed. Eleanor followed his gaze, noticing a pickup truck moving slowly a few houses back. The hum of its engine had been faint at first, but now it lingered ominously. 4 men leaned out of the truck's windows, their laughter breaking the quiet like shattering glass. It was a harsh, cruel sound that made Eleanor's stomach tighten. Her pace remained steady, though her grip on Duke's leash tightened. "Just keep walking," she murmured under her breath. But Duke's low growl betrayed the unease they both felt. "Nice dog," one of the men called out, his voice dripping with mockery. Eleanor didn't respond, her eyes fixed forward, her calm exterior masked the rapid pounding of her heart. The truck stopped abruptly, and the sound of doors slamming echoed through the street. The men climbed out, their heavy boots crunching against the pavement. "Afternoon, ma'am," the tallest one called, his grin icy and devoid of warmth. He strode forward, flanked by the others, whose faces radiated a mix of amusement and malice. "Out for a stroll?" Eleanor's steps slowed, but she didn't stop. "It's a beautiful day, isn't it?" she replied, her voice measured. Her hand tightened around Duke's leash as the dog moved protectively closer, his growl deepening. The tallest man chuckled, gesturing toward her necklace. "That's some real nice jewelry you've got there. Looks expensive." "It's not for sale," Eleanor replied curtly, keeping her voice firm. She took a deliberate step forward, but the men spread out, blocking her path. "Where you headed in such a hurry?" another man sneered, stepping closer. His smirk was oily, his posture menacing. Eleanor stopped. She knew she couldn't outrun them, and running wasn't her way. She planted her feet, her eyes steely. "Just taking a walk," she said, her voice steady but edged with warning. The tall man leaned in, feigning politeness. "Relax, lady, we're just admiring, no harm in that." "Admire it from where you are," Eleanor shot back, her tone sharp. She started forward again, Duke keeping pace, his bark sudden and sharp, a sound that sent a ripple of unease through the group. The tall man's smirk wavered, but he quickly recovered, crossing his arms. "Feisty for an old lady, huh? What are you so scared of, you or your dog losing his nerve?" Eleanor's lips tightened. "You should listen to him," she said coldly. "He's smarter than all of you put together." The man's face reddened with anger. "Look, we don't want to hurt you," he sneered, stepping closer. "Just hand over that necklace, maybe the bracelet too, and we'll be on our way." Eleanor stood firm. "What makes you think you can just threaten me and walk away?" "Because no one cares," one of the younger men interjected, his voice dripping with venom. "You're just some old black lady. You think anyone gives a damn about what happens to you in this country?" The words struck like a whip, but Eleanor's expression didn't falter. She had faced hate before, endured the undercurrents of prejudice in this town for years. Her grip on Duke's leash tightened, and as her loyal companion growled low and steady, she drew on the strength that had carried her through countless challenges. Her voice, calm but razor-sharp, cut through the venom in the air. "If you're so sure no one cares, why don't you try me and find out?" The belief that men like this carried the idea that her life was somehow worth less only fueled Eleanor's resolve. She refused to show any hint of fear. "You picked the wrong woman," she said, her tone firm and unyielding. "Back off now or you'll regret it." The tallest man chuckled, shaking his head as though amused. "Regret it? Lady, we're doing you a favor. Just hand over the goods, and nobody gets hurt. You wouldn't want things to get messy." Before Eleanor could reply, Duke barked sharply, louder than before, his entire body tense, his teeth bared. The men's smug expressions faltered as the dog's growl deepened, a warning that reverberated through the quiet street. They exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier bravados starting to crack. One of them, emboldened but hesitant, stepped forward, pointing at Duke. "That mutt's all bark, no bite. You can't scare us with your furry little bodyguard." Eleanor didn't flinch, her gaze unwavering as she coldly replied, "Try me. He's not bluffing and neither am I." The red-faced man snorted, forcing a laugh to mask his unease. "Yeah, right. What's he gonna do, slobber us to death?" Eleanor stepped forward, her voice sharp and cutting. "He'll do whatever it takes to protect me, and you'll wish you'd listened." For a moment, the group hesitated. Duke's growls filled the space, the sound wrapping around them like an impending storm. But the red-faced man shook his head and turned to his companions. "She's full of it. Let's just take what we came for." The tallest man nodded and moved closer. "Fine. You don't want to cooperate? Guess we'll do this the hard way." The men began to spread out, their movements calculated as they circled Eleanor. She stepped back, keeping Duke close, her heart hammering in her chest. She knew she couldn't take them on physically, but Duke wasn't just a dog. He was a force to be reckoned with. "You're making a mistake," Eleanor warned, her voice steady. "Walk away now, while you still can." The tallest man sneered. Big talk for someone with no backup. "Who says I'm alone?" Eleanor countered, subtly flicking her gaze toward a security camera perched on a nearby garage. She didn't know if it was recording, but she hoped the gesture would give them pause. The men followed her glance, but quickly dismissed it. The red-faced man scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Oh please, no one's coming. You're on your own, lady." One of the men darted forward, testing Duke's resolve. The Rottweiler barked ferociously, snapping his jaws just inches from the man's outstretched hand. The would-be attacker recoiled, stumbling back and cursing. "Damn dog," he shouted. "This isn't worth it." "Yes, it is," the tallest man barked, his voice tense. "She's bluffing. That mutt can't take all of us." Eleanor stood her ground, her voice sharp as steel. "He won't have to." The street fell silent save for the menacing growls of Duke, whose every muscle was coiled and ready. The tension thickened as the men drew closer, their taunts growing louder but their movements betraying unease. "This is your last chance," the tallest man said coldly. "Hand over the necklace or we'll take it. Your mutt can't stop all of us." Eleanor glanced at Duke, who stood tall, his teeth bared in a feral snarl. "You think you're the first cowards to try and take what doesn't belong to them? Go ahead," she said coolly, her voice daring. "See how that works out for you." The challenge was too much for the red-faced man, who lunged first, reaching for Eleanor's arm. Duke launched himself forward, a blur of black and tan fury. His bark was deafening, his teeth sinking into the man's sleeve before he could touch Eleanor. With a force that belied his size, Duke yanked the man backward, sending him sprawling onto the pavement. The man screamed, clutching his arm as he writhed on the ground. "Get him off me! Get this damn dog off me!" he howled, his voice cracking with panic. "Call him off," one of the others shouted, their earlier bravado crumbling. Eleanor stood firm, her grip on Duke's leash steady. "I warned you," she said, her tone even. "This is on you." The tallest man cursed under his breath and motioned for one of the others to intervene, but none dared step closer, their fear paralyzing them as Duke stood over the red-faced man, snarling, his hackles raised. "Come on," one of them urged, though his voice trembled. "There's 4 of us, it's just a dog." Eleanor's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and biting. "Just a dog? He's braver and more loyal than any of you could ever dream of being." The remaining men hesitated, their confidence unraveling as Duke's growls continued to echo. The balance of power had shifted, and for the first time, Eleanor saw doubt in their eyes. Another man darted forward, aiming for Duke's leash. Duke moved with lightning speed, his jaws snapping mere inches from the man's hand. The would-be attacker recoiled, stumbling back into his companions, his face pale with fear. Eleanor's voice rang out, steady and cutting. "Pathetic. 4 grown men and you can't even handle one old lady and her dog." The tallest man's face twisted with anger, his composure finally cracking. "Enough of this," he bellowed, his temper snapping. He lunged toward Eleanor, his hand reaching for the chain around her neck. Before he could tug it free, Duke launched himself forward, his powerful jaws clamping onto the man's jacket. With a ferocious growl, Duke shook the man violently, sending him off balance. "Stop! Stop!" the man screamed, flailing as he tried to push Duke away. His companions stood frozen, their indecision etched across their faces. The red-faced man, still cradling his injured arm, spat from the ground. "She's not worth this. Let's just go." But the tallest man wasn't ready to admit defeat. "No way," he snarled, his words defiant but his tone betraying desperation. "Not until we get what we came for." Eleanor stood firm, her grip steady on Duke's leash. Her eyes scanned the scene, briefly landing on the security camera perched above a garage across the street. She knew it was recording everything: the aggression, the hatred, the desperation. That camera was her silent witness, and it gave her the resolve to speak again. "Leave now," Eleanor said, her voice like steel, "and maybe you'll walk away with what little dignity you have left." One of the men, his voice trembling, sneered weakly. "You think you're in control here? We're not scared of you." Eleanor's icy retort was immediate. "Then why are you still standing there? You had every chance to walk away, and this is what you chose instead." The tallest man managed to shove Duke off, stumbling backward with a face flushed with fury and humiliation. "We're not leaving empty-handed," he growled, spitting onto the ground. "You'll regret this." Duke barked again, the sound louder and more commanding than before. He took a step toward the group, his sheer size and unrelenting aggression forcing them to shrink back once more. The red-faced man scrambled to his feet, his injured arm hanging limply at his side. He looked at his companions for support, but none of them returned his gaze. "This is a waste of time," one of the younger men muttered, his voice shaky. "Shut up," the tallest man snapped, glaring at him. "We're not done." "Actually, you are," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the rising chaos like a blade. She stepped forward, Duke moving with her, both of them exuding an unshakable presence that made the men falter. "This is your last warning. Leave now, or I won't call Duke off next time." The group hesitated, their bravado crumbling as they exchanged anxious glances. The earlier confidence they had flaunted was unraveling under Duke's relentless growls and Eleanor's unwavering defiance. Yet the tallest man's pride refused to let him retreat. He squared his shoulders, turning to his group with venom dripping from his voice. "We're not letting her win," he growled. "It's 4 of us and 1 dog. She can't stop all of us." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, her grip firm on Duke's leash. "4 of you?" she said dryly. "Seems my dog's already outmatched you." The red-faced man cursed under his breath, clutching his injured arm. "Let's just take her stuff and leave. I'm not sticking around to get bit again." "She's bluffing," the tallest man snapped, stepping forward. "She can't control that dog forever." Duke barked sharply, the sound slicing through the heavy tension and echoing off the quiet suburban homes. The men flinched, startled yet again. This time, the tallest man lunged suddenly, his hands outstretched toward Eleanor's necklace. The chaos erupted in an instant. Duke surged forward, breaking free of Eleanor's grasp on the leash. His powerful body collided with the man, knocking him to the ground with a resounding thud. The man's scream tore through the air as Duke pinned him, growling ferociously, his bared teeth mere inches from the man's terrified face. "Help me!" the man shouted, his voice cracking with panic. He thrashed against Duke's weight, all traces of bravado gone. "Get him off!" But his companions stood frozen, their courage evaporating as they watched their leader struggle helplessly beneath the massive dog. The red-faced man took a shaky step back, his gaze darting around in search of an escape route. The others exchanged panicked looks, their earlier unity dissolving into fear and indecision. One man hesitated, his foot inching forward, but Duke's ferocious snarl stopped him cold. The dog's bared teeth glinted in the late afternoon light and the man froze, his courage evaporating in an instant. Eleanor's voice cut through the tense silence like a blade. "Not so bold now, are you?" she said icily, standing tall despite the rapid thudding of her heart. "Shut up!" one of the others yelled, but the tremor in his voice betrayed his lack of confidence. His shout was immediately drowned out by another sound, a distant wailing noise that grew louder with every passing second. Sirens. The men's heads whipped around, their expressions shifting from bravado to panic. The unmistakable sound of approaching police cars sent ripples of unease through the group. One of them swore loudly, his face paling as he backed away. "Cops! We've got to go!" "Not without him!" another protested, gesturing toward the man still pinned under Duke. The leader thrashed beneath the dog's powerful grip, his face contorted in fear. "Get me out of here!" he screamed, his voice raw with desperation. Not, but none of them moved to help. Eleanor crossed her arms, her expression stern and unyielding. Looks like your friends are smarter than you, she said coldly. They're about to run and leave you to face the consequences alone. The red-faced man clutching his injured arm made the first move. Screw this, I'm not going to jail, he muttered before turning and bolting toward the truck. The others followed his lead, scrambling into the vehicle and slamming the doors shut. Wait, don't leave me, the leader shouted after them, his voice cracking with desperation. But the truck roared to life, its tires screeching as it sped off, disappearing around the corner just as the sirens grew louder. The red and blue lights of a police cruiser washed over the street, illuminating the tense scene. Eleanor took a cautious step forward, her voice steady but commanding. Duke, hold. The dog obeyed instantly, his growling subsiding slightly, though his stance remained firm. He kept the man pinned to the ground, his sharp teeth hovering just inches from the man's trembling face. The leader's chest heaved as he gasped for air, his arrogance long gone. You don't understand, he stammered, his voice shaking. It wasn't supposed to be like this, You just what? Eleanor interrupted, her tone razor sharp. Thought you could intimidate an old lady? Rob me because you assumed no one would care? Because you thought no one would stop you? Her eyes were like ice. You're going to regret every decision you made today. The police cruiser came to a stop, and Officer James Carter stepped out, his hand resting cautiously on his holstered weapon as he surveyed the scene. Mrs. Davis, are you all right? He called, his tone steady but concerned. Eleanor nodded, her hand firm on Duke's leash. We're fine, Officer Carter. Duke made sure of that. The officer's gaze shifted to the man on the ground, his expression hardening. I see that. Good work, Duke. He crouched slightly, his voice firm but calm. Don't move, buddy. Don't make this harder on yourself. The man whimpered, his breath coming in panicked gasps. Get this dog off me, he pleaded, his voice cracking. Eleanor's expression didn't soften, not until you're cuffed and in that car. Carter moved quickly, securing the man's hands behind his back with practiced ease. Okay, Mrs. Davis, you can call him off now. Duke, release, Eleanor commanded. The dog stepped back immediately, his body still tense and alert as he returned to her side. She knelt beside him, stroking his ears gently. Good boy, she murmured. You did good. The man groaned as Carter hauled him to his feet. Where are your friends? The officer demanded. They left me, the man mumbled, his gaze fixed on the ground. Smart of them, Carter muttered before turning to Eleanor. We'll handle it from here. Are you sure you're okay? Eleanor stood tall, her hand resting protectively on Duke's head. We're okay now, but I want to make sure this doesn't happen again. It won't, Carter assured her, leading the man toward the cruiser. Not if I have anything to say about it. The slam of the car door echoed down the street and Eleanor let out a deep breath, her shoulders relaxing slightly for the first time. Duke leaned against her leg, wagging his tail as if sensing the danger had passed. Let's go home, boy, she said softly, giving him a small smile. As the last police cruiser drove away, Eleanor stood on the sidewalk in front of her house, the evening air cool against her skin. The neighborhood was quiet again, but the weight of the confrontation lingered. Duke sat at her feet, his ears still perked as he scanned the street, ever vigilant. She reached down to pat his head, her fingers trembling slightly despite her outward composure. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking the silence. Pulling it out, she saw Officer Carter's name on the screen. Mrs. Davis, his steady voice greeted her. Just wanted to let you know we've got the man your dog stopped in custody. We'll need you to come down to the station to give a full statement. Eleanor straightened, her voice firm. Of course, I want to see this through. A short time later, Eleanor walked into the police station, her steps steady and purposeful. The buzzing atmosphere of the precinct was a stark contrast to the quiet determination she carried. Duke was at home, resting after his courageous actions, but his presence felt like a steadying force within her. Officer Carter met her at the front desk and offered a small nod of acknowledgement. Thanks for coming in, he said, motioning her to follow. He led her down a narrow corridor to a small, plain interview room. Gesturing to a chair, he placed a clipboard on the table before sitting across from her. We've got Brian Tanner in holding, he began. The guy Duke took down. He's not exactly being cooperative, but I thought you might want to have a word with him before we take your full statement. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. You're saying I can speak to him? Carter nodded. Within limits, yes. Sometimes hearing directly from the victim makes a difference. Just know I'll be there the whole time. She hesitated for a moment, then straightened her posture. "Take me to him." A guard escorted her to the holding area, where a steel door opened to reveal a small room with a table and 2 chairs. Brian Tanner sat slumped in one of the chairs, his face pale and his arm poorly bandaged. His earlier arrogance had been replaced by a mix of discomfort and simmering resentment. Eleanor entered, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she met his gaze. Her expression was calm yet resolute. "Brian Tanner," she said evenly, her voice carrying weight. "So, that's your name." Brian leaned back in his chair, attempting a smirk, though it faltered. "What's it to you, lady?" She took the seat across from him, folding her hands on the table. "You and your friends decided to target me in broad daylight. I think I'm entitled to know who thought they could get away with it." Brian scoffed, his smirk fading. "Target you? We weren't trying to hurt you or anything. We just wanted what you had. You didn't have to make it such a big deal." Eleanor's voice sharpened and she leaned forward. "A big deal? You and your friends followed me, threatened me, and tried to rob me. My dog saved you from something far worse. Tell me, Mr. Tanner, if you'd gotten what you wanted, would it have ended there?" Brian's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. "You assumed no one would care," Eleanor continued, her voice unwavering. "You figured I'd be easy prey because I'm old, because I'm black, because you thought no one would stand up for me. Isn't that right?" Brian's smirk disappeared completely. He looked away, his fingers tapping anxiously on the table. "I don't have to listen to this," he muttered. Eleanor leaned back, her expression cold. "No, you don't. But you'll have to listen to the judge when this goes to trial. Every detail is caught on camera. There's no hiding from what you and your friends did." Brian shifted uncomfortably, his shoulders sagging. "They ran," he muttered bitterly, shaking his head. "They left me behind." "Cowards," Eleanor said bluntly. "But you followed them, you made your choices, and now you get to live with the consequences." He shot her a glare, but it lacked conviction. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," Eleanor replied, her tone steely. "I know you thought you were untouchable. You thought you could intimidate me. Let me tell you something, Mr. Tanner. You've got nothing that scares me." Before he could respond, the door opened and Officer Carter stepped in. "That's enough," he said, giving Eleanor a nod. "Thank you, Mrs. Davis. I think we've got what we need." Eleanor rose, her gaze lingering on Brian for a moment longer. "Start thinking about how you got here, Mr. Tanner," she said firmly. "This is just the beginning of your reckoning." With that, she walked out, her footsteps echoing in the corridor. Back in the interview room, she sat down once more to provide her full statement. Her mind remained steady, her determination unshaken. The fight for justice wasn't over, but she was ready for the next step. The following morning, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. The events of the previous day played vividly in her mind, refusing to fade. Duke lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws, occasionally glancing up at her as if sensing her lingering tension. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She reached for it and saw Officer Carter's name on the screen. "Good morning, Mrs. Davis," his steady voice greeted her. "I thought you'd like to know. 2 more of the men from yesterday have been arrested." Eleanor exhaled slowly, her grip firm on the phone. "That's good to hear. Where did you find them?" "Turns out they weren't too far," Carter replied. "One of them was hiding out at a relative's place, and the other was trying to blend in, laying low in plain sight. Once we issued the warrants and ran the footage, it didn't take long to track them down. Tanner's cooperation, or lack thereof, didn't even matter. The security footage was clear enough to identify the entire group." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. "What about the driver?" "We're closing in on him," Carter assured. "It's only a matter of time. Once he's in custody, the DA can move forward with formal charges." Eleanor placed her coffee down, her gaze shifting to the quiet street outside her window. "Good. They need to be held accountable for what they did." "I will," Carter said firmly. "But there's something else I wanted to let you know. The arrests are making waves. Local media picked up the story and it's already sparking reactions." "Reactions?" Eleanor's voice sharpened. "There's a lot of talk," Carter admitted. "Most of it supportive, but you know how it goes. Some folks are already trying to downplay it, saying it's not as bad as it looks, or that the men didn't mean any harm. The usual nonsense." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "Let them talk, the truth is on our side." Later that afternoon, Eleanor found herself at the grocery store. As she moved down the aisles, she felt the weight of lingering glances. Some were curious, others sympathetic, and a few carried the unmistakable edge of judgment. Near the produce section, a familiar face approached her. "Eleanor, I heard about what happened," the woman said in a hushed, insistent tone. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, thank you," Eleanor replied, her voice polite but measured. "Duke and I handled it." The woman nodded but hesitated, her expression tinged with discomfort. "It's just such a shame, isn't it? Young men these days, they just don't think." Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly, her tone sharpening. "No, they don't. But this wasn't a matter of not thinking. They knew exactly what they were doing." The woman flinched at the directness of Eleanor's words, quickly offering a tight, awkward smile before mumbling an excuse and walking away. Eleanor watched her retreat, frustration and determination swirling inside her. That evening, Eleanor turned on the television, flipping through channels until she landed on the local news. The reporter stood in front of the police station, her somber expression mirroring the weight of the story. "The arrests of 2 additional suspects today bring the total to 3, the reporter began. "The suspects are accused of attempting to rob Mrs. Eleanor Davis, a retired teacher, during her afternoon walk. The confrontation, partially captured on a neighbor's security camera, has sparked both outrage and debate within the community." The footage played briefly, showing the men closing in on Eleanor and Duke's decisive intervention. Watching the clip of Duke pinning Tanner to the ground brought a faint smile to Eleanor's lips, but it faded as the reporter continued. "While many in the community have expressed support for Mrs. Davis, some have questioned the severity of the charges, claiming the suspects were simply misguided and that the situation escalated unnecessarily." Eleanor's hands curled into fists. "Misguided," she muttered under her breath. "They attacked me in broad daylight and they called that misguided?" The segment shifted to interviews with community members. A younger woman appeared on the screen, her voice filled with conviction. "What happened to Mrs. Davis is unacceptable. No one should feel unsafe walking in their own neighborhood." The next speaker, a middle-aged man, wore a skeptical expression. "I mean, yeah, they shouldn't have done it, but people are acting like these guys are hardened criminals. It's not like they hurt anyone." Eleanor turned off the television, her frustration boiling over as she began pacing the living room. The audacity of people excusing blatant violence left her fuming. She had fought to protect herself and Duke, and now she had to endure others diminishing her experience. Duke watched her intently, sitting up as her movements quickened. She paused, kneeling beside him to stroke his fur. "They think they can talk their way out of this, boy," she said softly, her voice tinged with determination. "But they're wrong. They picked the wrong woman." The phone rang, breaking the silence. Eleanor answered briskly. "Hello? Mrs. Davis, this is Jessica Nguyen," the voice on the other end said, calm and professional. "I've been assigned as the prosecutor for your case." Eleanor's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Thank you for calling, Mrs. Gianye. I want to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." "Trust me, it won't," Jessica replied. "The evidence is strong and we're pursuing the maximum penalties. I'll keep you updated as we prepare for the arraignment." Eleanor felt her breath steady as the officers approached. Duke remained still but alert, his intense gaze fixed on the man pinned beneath him. One of the officers spoke firmly. "Ma'am, please step back, we'll handle it." Nodding, Eleanor tightened her grip on Duke's leash and gave a clear command. "Duke, release." The dog hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping back, his growl subsiding, but his body still poised as if ready to act again. He sat beside Eleanor, his eyes unwavering as the officers moved in. The man on the ground writhed, his voice a mix of fear and anger. "This is a mistake. I didn't do anything." "Sure you didn't," one officer replied flatly as he pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "Keep resisting, and you'll add more charges to your list." The man's protests grew louder, but they didn't stop the officers from securing him. As they hauled him to his feet, his gaze darted to Eleanor. "You think you've won? This doesn't mean anything." Eleanor stepped forward slightly, her expression steely. "It means you're finally going to face the consequences. That's more than enough." The officers led the man to the waiting patrol car, his protests muffled as they closed the door. One officer turned back to Eleanor, giving her a respectful nod. "That was some quick thinking, Mrs. Davis. You and Duke made our job a lot easier." Eleanor glanced down at Duke, whose tail wagged slightly now that the tension had dissipated. "Duke did all the heavy lifting," she said with a faint smile, scratching behind his ears. "He always does." As the officers drove away with their suspect in custody, Eleanor stood in the quiet of the park, the adrenaline finally beginning to wear off. She crouched beside Duke, holding his leash tightly. Good boy, she murmured. You always know what to do. Back at home, Eleanor settled into her chair with a cup of tea, Duke curled up at her feet. The events of the day lingered in her mind, but they no longer felt overwhelming. Her phone buzzed on the side table, and she picked it up to see Jessica Guan's name on the screen. Mrs. Davis, Jessica greeted her warmly. I just heard the news. The fourth suspect is in custody. Excellent work out there. Eleanor smiled faintly. Duke deserves the credit. He's the one who stopped him. From what I've heard, you're both heroes today, Jessica replied, her tone sincere. With all 4 suspects in custody, the case is solid. We're in a great position for the trial. Eleanor leaned back, her resolve firm. That's good to hear, but it's not just about this trial. People need to know that actions like theirs come with consequences. Jessica's tone was equally resolute, and that's exactly what we'll ensure. I'll keep you updated as we prepare. For now, take some time to rest. You've earned it. As the call ended, Eleanor set her phone down and looked at Duke, who raised his head at her movement. She reached down, giving him a gentle pat. You're my hero, boy, she said softly. Duke wagged his tail, his calm demeanor comforting her. The fight wasn't over, but Eleanor knew she had what it took to see it through, and with Duke by her side, she wouldn't be standing alone. Eleanor remained seated, her gaze unwavering, as she locked eyes with Mick. The room felt heavy with unspoken truths, and Mick's nervous fidgeting only amplified the weight of the moment. You didn't want to end up here, Eleanor repeated, her voice steady but cutting. Then why did you think you could threaten me and walk away without consequences? Because I'm older? Because I'm black? Or because you thought people like me just let things go? Mick's lips parted but no words came out. His gaze dropped to the table, his fingers twitching as if searching for a way to explain the inexplicable. It was Tanner's idea, he muttered again, almost to himself. He said you wouldn't fight back, that no one would care. Well, you were wrong, Eleanor said firmly. Every one of you was wrong. Jessica leaned forward, her expression unyielding. Mr. Lewis, you need to understand something. Claiming you were just the driver doesn't absolve you. You were there, you supported this plan, and now you're facing the full weight of your choices. Mick shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his pale face growing paler. I never wanted to hurt anyone, he said, his voice cracking. I needed the money. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. And you thought the best way to get it was by terrorizing someone you thought was vulnerable. Well, here's something for you to think about, Mr. Lewis. Just because someone looks vulnerable doesn't mean they are. Mick opened his mouth to respond but closed it again when Jessica raised a hand to silence him. We've heard enough, Jessica said, her tone final. You'll have plenty of time to think about your actions, where you're headed. The officers stepped forward to escort Mick out of the room. As they led him away, he cast one last glance over his shoulder at Eleanor. His expression was a mixture of regret and fear, but Eleanor didn't flinch. She watched him leave, her posture straight and her resolve unshaken. When the door closed behind him, Jessica turned to Eleanor. He's scared, she said. But fear doesn't erase guilt. He'll face the same charges as the others. Eleanor nodded slowly, her hands resting on the table. Good. People like him need to learn that their actions have consequences. Jessica gathered her files, her tone softening slightly. You've been incredible through all of this, Mrs. Davis. Your strength, it's inspiring. Eleanor gave a faint smile, but her eyes remained serious. This isn't just about me. It's about making sure no one else thinks they can get away with what they tried to do. As Jessica left the room, Eleanor sat for a moment longer, gathering her thoughts. She felt the weight of the day pressing down on her, but alongside it was a steady current of determination. She stood, straightened her shoulders, and left the room, ready to see this fight through to the end. After Eleanor repeated the attorney's suggestion, her voice cut through the courtroom like steel. Escalated the situation? She said, her gaze sharp and unwavering. Duke didn't escalate anything. He protected me when these men tried to harm me. If it wasn't for him, who knows what they would have done? The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably but pressed on. Do you think a dog's aggression could have provoked more fear than intended? Eleanor's expression remained firm. Fear? She asked pointedly. They didn't seem scared when they cornered me in broad daylight. Duke didn't provoke them, they provoked him by threatening me, and he did exactly what he was trained to do, protect. Jessica stood, her voice calm but commanding. Mrs. Davis, would you say Duke acted in response to their aggression? Eleanor nodded. Without question. He responded to their actions. If they hadn't attacked me, Duke wouldn't have needed to intervene. The courtroom murmured. the gravity of her words rippling through the space. The judge called for order, and the defense attorney sat down, visibly deflated. When Eleanor finished her testimony, she stepped down from the stand, her steps steady and her shoulders square. She returned to her seat, feeling the weight of her words but knowing she had spoken the truth. Jessica gave her a small nod of approval before calling the next witness, Officer Carter. Carter's testimony reinforced Eleanor's account. He described arriving on the scene, the state of the suspects, and how Duke had helped subdue Brian Tanner until the officers could intervene. He presented the security footage, which played on a screen for the jury. The video showed the men circling Eleanor, their taunts escalating into threats, and Duke's decisive action to protect her. The footage was damning, and the tension in the room thickened as it played. When the defense cross-examined Carter, they tried to suggest that the situation might have been exaggerated. Would you agree, Officer Carter, that the suspects were young and might not have fully grasped the consequences of their actions? One attorney asked. Carter's tone didn't waver. I would agree that they were old enough to plan an attack, execute it, and flee the scene when it didn't go their way. Their age doesn't excuse their actions. Jessica used the momentum to present additional evidence. Financial records showed Tanner's history of petty crimes escalating into more organized efforts. Witnesses from the neighborhood spoke about their unease after spotting the group lingering in the area. Each piece of evidence wove a tighter web around the defendants. When the trial moved into closing arguments, Jessica rose with a commanding presence. This case isn't just about one afternoon in the park, she began. It's about the choices these men made. They believed they could target someone vulnerable, that they could threaten and intimidate her without consequences. They believed no one would care. They were wrong. She gestured toward Eleanor. Mrs. Davis had the courage to stand her ground. She had the courage to fight back and to hold them accountable, and now it's your turn to show that these actions won't go unchecked. The defense attorneys made their final pleas, painting the defendants as misguided rather than malicious. But the evidence was overwhelming and their arguments felt hollow against the mountain of testimony and proof. When the judge sent the jury to deliberate, the room exhaled collectively. Eleanor sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap as she waited. The minutes stretched into hours, but her resolve didn't waver. Finally, the jury returned. The foreman stood holding a slip of paper. On the charge of attempted robbery, we find the defendants guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit assault, we find the defendants guilty. A collective murmur rippled through the courtroom. Brian Tanner's smug expression cracked, replaced by disbelief. McLewis slumped in his seat, his face pale. The other two looked down, their defiance replaced with resignation. Eleanor exhaled slowly, a quiet sense of triumph washing over her. Justice had been served. As the judge began to announce the sentencing phase, Eleanor allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. She had done her part, and she knew she had made a difference. Eleanor's sharp gaze pinned the defense attorney in place as he tried to frame Duke's actions as unnecessary. Her voice was calm but firm as she responded, Duke acted to protect me and himself. He responded to the threat your clients created. If they had left when warned, none of this would have happened. The attorney opened his mouth to counter, but the prosecutor, Jessica Nguyen, interjected smoothly. Objection, Your Honor. The defense is attempting to shift blame away from the criminal actions of their clients. Sustained, the judge said firmly. The attorney retreated, clearly frustrated. Eleanor stepped down from the stand after finishing her testimony, her back straight and her head high. She returned to her seat beside Jessica, who whispered, You handled that perfectly. They didn't rattle you at all. I didn't come here to be rattled, Eleanor replied, her tone even. I came here for the truth. Next, Officer James Carter was called to the stand. His testimony laid out the timeline of the arrests with precise detail. He described how he'd arrived at the scene to find Brian Tanner pinned by Duke, how the suspects had fled, and how security footage had identified the rest of the group. His recounting was matter of fact, but it left no room for ambiguity. The security footage was played again, this time with Carter providing narration. As you can see here, he said, pointing to the screen, the truck slows as Mrs. Davis walks. The defendants exit surrounding her. You'll notice Mrs. Davis warning them to leave, and when they refuse, her dog Duke intervenes. The jury watched intently as the video unfolded. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the defendants lunged at Eleanor, only to be thwarted by Duke. The bravery of the dog and the composure of his owner shone clearly on the grainy footage. By the time Carter finished, the courtroom was buzzing with tension. The defense team scrambled to discredit his testimony, suggesting the men had simply made a mistake. But Carter didn't waver. "This was no mistake," he said firmly. "The actions of the defendants were deliberate, calculated, and carried out with malicious intent." The final witness for the prosecution was Michael "Mick" Lewis. His cooperation with the prosecution had earned him a reduced sentence, and he now sat nervously on the stand, his hands gripping the edge of the seat. Mick described how Brian Tanner had come up with the plan, how he had reassured the group that no one would care about their victim, and how it would be an easy score. "They underestimated her," Mick admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "She wasn't what they thought she'd be." Jessica pressed him on the details. "And you? What did you think?" Mick hesitated, his gaze dropping. "I thought the same thing, that she wouldn't fight back. I was wrong." As Mick left the stand, his testimony left the courtroom heavy with unspoken condemnation. Eleanor studied the jury, noting their expressions. Most looked somber, their earlier skepticism replaced by what seemed to be dawning understanding. When the day's proceedings ended, Eleanor stepped outside into the cool evening air. Jessica joined her a moment later, her expression tinged with quiet satisfaction. "You were incredible today," Jessica said. "Your testimony, the footage, Officer Carter's account, it's all coming together." "It's not just me," Eleanor said, glancing toward the courthouse steps. "Duke's actions spoke louder than anything I could have said." Jessica smiled. "He's a hero, no doubt about that, but don't downplay your role. You showed strength when it mattered most." Eleanor nodded, a flicker of hope warming her chest. "Do you think the jury sees it that way?" "They'd have to be blind not to," Jessica replied. "The case is strong. The truth is on our side." As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, Eleanor took a deep breath. This fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time she allowed herself to believe that justice was within reach. Eleanor's sharp gaze followed the defense attorneys as they made their final appeals for leniency. Their words sounded hollow, each argument failing to pierce the overwhelming evidence presented. The courtroom was tense as Judge Reynolds prepared to deliver the sentences, her expression firm and resolute. "Brian Tanner," the judge began, her tone steady yet unyielding, "you orchestrated this crime, targeting Mrs. Davis not only for her possessions but with the explicit belief that her age and race made her an easy victim. Your actions were deliberate, calculated, and cruel. For this, you are sentenced to 12 years in state prison with no possibility of parole for the first 8. Tanner's smirk, which had persisted throughout much of the trial, dissolved instantly. His shoulders slumped and his face reflected the crushing realization of his punishment. "James Foley and Kyle Mercer," the judge continued, her gaze shifting to the other 2 men. "You willingly participated in this act and contributed to the danger Mrs. Davis faced. Your actions were reprehensible. You are each sentenced to 10 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 6. Foley exhaled sharply, his hands trembling on the table, while Mercer buried his face in his hands, shaking his head in disbelief. Finally, Judge Reynolds turned her attention to the last defendant. "Michael Lewis," she said, her tone softening slightly. "You cooperated with the prosecution and provided testimony that was critical in securing these convictions. However, your role as the driver is not without consequence. You are sentenced to 5 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after 3. Lewis nodded faintly, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his punishment. For a brief moment his eyes flicked toward Eleanor, his lips parted as if to speak but no words came, and he quickly looked away. Judge Reynolds addressed the defendants one final time, her voice carrying the weight of justice. "Your sentences reflect the harm you have caused and the message this court must send. Targeting vulnerable individuals with malice and cruelty will not be tolerated. This case is adjourned." The sharp crack of her gavel echoed through the room and the courtroom erupted into motion. Reporters surged forward, eager to capture reactions, while families of the defendants whispered in hushed tones. The convicted men were escorted out in handcuffs, their fates sealed. As Brian Tanner was led away, he glanced over his shoulder at Eleanor, his eyes filled with anger and defeat. She held his gaze for a brief moment, her expression calm and unflinching before turning back to Jessica. "You did it," Jessica said, her voice warm with accomplishment. "We did it," Eleanor corrected, a small but triumphant smile gracing her lips. "Justice was served, that's what matters." Outside the courthouse, Eleanor was met with a gathering of neighbors and supporters. Many offered words of admiration and encouragement, though a few remained distant, their discomfort with the situation apparent. Eleanor accepted their support graciously, her resolve unwavering. She had fought for this moment, and it had finally come. When she arrived home later that day, the weight of the trial began to lift. Duke greeted her enthusiastically at the door, his tail wagging furiously and a joyful bark announcing her return. She knelt to wrap her arms around him, burying her face in his fur. "It's over, boy," she whispered softly. "We did it. Justice was served." Duke wagged his tail harder, leaning into her embrace. His loyalty and love were a balm to her spirit, a constant reminder of the strength they had shared through the ordeal. Eleanor stood and walked to the kitchen, her steps lighter than they had been in weeks. Tonight wasn't just about moving forward, it was about celebrating how far they had come. She prepared a special meal for Duke, roasting chicken to perfection and pairing it with rice, carrots, and a few of his favorite treats. The delicious aroma filled the air, and Duke sat alert, his gaze locked on her every move. His tail thumped against the floor with eager anticipation. "You've been patient, boy," she said with a small laugh as she placed the dish on the floor. "Now it's your turn to be spoiled." Duke didn't hesitate, diving into his meal with gusto. Eleanor leaned against the counter, watching him with a contented smile. Her thoughts wandered to the courtroom, to the tense moments on the stand, and to the strength she had drawn from Duke's steadfast presence. They had faced hatred and violence together and emerged victorious. The fight for justice wasn't easy, but they had shown that courage and determination could prevail. The memory of the men's sneers, their hateful words, and the fear they had tried to instill lingered faintly in Eleanor's mind, but their power over her was gone. She had faced them, stood firm, and emerged victorious. Their actions had attempted to diminish her, but instead, they had only strengthened her resolve. As Duke finished his meal, he padded over to her, his head nuzzling her hand as if sensing her reflections. She knelt, stroking his thick fur with gratitude. "You were my hero, Duke," she said softly, her voice steady with emotion. "You stood by me when I needed you most. I couldn't have done this without you." The living room felt peaceful as Eleanor moved to her armchair. The quiet hum of the evening enveloped her, a stark contrast to the chaos that had once gripped her life. She gazed out the window at the street illuminated by soft streetlight glows. This was the same street where everything had happened, but tonight it felt transformed. It felt like a sanctuary. Her thoughts turned inward, reflecting on the lessons of her ordeal. The attack had been a harsh reminder of the ugliness that still pervaded the world, the prejudice, entitlement, and cruelty that emboldened those men, but it had also been a testament to her inner strength. Despite their intentions, they hadn't broken her. Instead, they had ignited a fire within her, a courage she hadn't known existed. She thought of the trial, of the words she had spoken in that courtroom. They hadn't just been for her, they were for every person who had been dismissed, underestimated, or dehumanized. The jury's verdict was a victory not just for her, but for the belief that people like her mattered, that justice could prevail even in the face of injustice. Duke nudged her hand again, pulling her back to the present. She smiled at him, his steady gaze a reminder that she had never been alone. He had been her protector, her steadfast ally, and her friend. "You deserve something special," she said, rising to retrieve a gift she had picked up earlier. She returned with a sturdy rope toy, knots on either end, perfect for Duke's powerful jaws. She tossed it to him and he pounced on it eagerly, tail wagging, carrying it triumphantly to his favorite spot. Eleanor chuckled, her heart warmed by his boundless joy. "You've earned that," she murmured, watching him play, "and so much more." Later, as the night deepened, Eleanor retrieved Duke's leash. The cool evening air met her as she opened the door, and Duke bounded to her side, his excitement palpable. Clipping the leash onto his collar, she stepped onto the quiet street. The neighborhood, once shadowed by fear and tension, now felt calm. The change hadn't come overnight, but she could feel it. Small steps towards something better. Eleanor and Duke walked in unison, the night sky above them glittering with stars that seemed brighter than ever. The air was crisp, and she felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in weeks. They had come through darkness, and in doing so they had found a renewed strength. Glancing down at Duke, she smiled. His ears were perked, his gait confident, and his presence a constant source of comfort. She reached down to pat his head, her voice soft but firm. "We're going to be just fine, Duke. Better than fine." As they rounded the corner and made their way back home, Eleanor felt gratitude well up inside her. She was thankful for Duke, for the justice system that had worked, and for her own unwavering resilience. Together, they had faced darkness and emerged into light. Stepping inside, Eleanor closed the door behind them, leaving the weight of the past on the other side. Duke settled into his favorite spot by the couch, his new toy securely between his paws. Eleanor sank into her chair, exhaling a deep, contented sigh. The battle was over, and the life they had reclaimed stretched ahead, full of promise and hope. This was not just an ending, it was a new beginning. Together they would greet tomorrow with strength and peace. And as the night deepened, Eleanor allowed herself to rest, knowing that she and Duke had truly won. If you were moved by Eleanor and Duke's journey, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more stories that inspire and empower.